Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining the fourth of a series of webinars we'll be hosting as Baringa partners in 2021, covering key themes and topics that will define a low-carbon future, featuring experts from Baringa and our clients. My name is Alesh Patel, and I'm the Global Strategy and Markets Lead for our energy and resources industry here at Baringa, and I'm delighted to be hosting this series of webinars. Our low-carbon future is here now, and 2021 is the inflection point. I think one need look no further than the fresh government commitments from the top emitting countries, the imminent approach of COP26, and a private sector focus on embedding climate change into investment decisions. 2021 will be the year of climate action. Whilst I think this might be an optimistic view that I hold, and perhaps only I hold, it comes with a warning. Our generation will be the first to feel the full effects of climate change and the last to be able to do anything about it. 2021, therefore, is the year when transition must become transformation, where we must deliver on the promises and commitments we've made to a low carbon future. In that context today, we'll focus on net zero ambitions set out by major emitting countries. Net zero decarbonisation policy defined and set by governments is framing the future long-term strategy of all industries. The Paris Agreement of 2015 was, for the majority of countries, the first demonstration of political support for a net zero target. The agreement, most importantly, had a commitment to the objective limiting global temperatures increases to below 2 degrees C, and achieving the 1.5 degree climate target itself, as a more ambitious target itself, will require global greenhouse gas emissions to reach net zero by 2070, with developed nations likely to need to move ahead of the global average. So government increasingly is driving decarbonisation policies through both Paris commitments being ratified and a strong alignment, which is ultimately, or lack of alignment, being challenged legally by various agencies and multi-institutional organisations. To date, 140 countries now have decarbonisation targets on the power sector alone, and net zero targets are becoming the new standard. And in particular, the EU has led the way on this, with 20 plus other countries either committing to or have committed to net zero targets in the time frame between 2030 and 2050. Net zero requires decarbonisation beyond just power, though. Transport and heat are harder decarbonisation, and the technology pathway is less clear. And if you look at power generation, has so far led the way in terms of reducing emissions in many global markets, enabled by falling levelized costs of renewable electricity. Electricity demand growth will drive it the other way, driven by electrification of heat, transport and industry, representing a major source of demand growth, and the greater volumes of electric vehicles and heat pumps will increase the flexibility of demand, with demand side response potentially becoming a key to price formation. But all of that is within the power sector and ignores the 80% plus of emissions that exist in other sectors. So to explore this issue, I have with me today Caspian Conran, who's Baringa's political economy lead. Caspian publishes Baringa's regular political economy update and provides a macroeconomic and low carbon economy update to many boards and execs. And today, Caspian is exploring how to understand the credibility and durability of challenges made on net zero. Looking at from Trump to Biden, US is the energy priorities and domestic risks facing the US. You'll look at the Chinese transition, progress to date, and competing priorities for the Communist Party. Before I hand you over to Caspian, I'd like to thank you again for joining. Encourage you to make this a really interactive session by posing and posting questions in the chat. And by all means, please raise your hand virtually if you'd like to ask a question outside of the chat. I'll aim to monitor both of those channels and draw you into the discussion during the webinar, and there'll be plenty of pauses all the way through. So please don't hesitate in joining in. The more interactive this webinar is, the better. So Caspian, with that, I'm delighted to be able to hand over to you to take you through, for you to take us through your assessment of the net zero commitments of major emitting economies.
Thanks very much, Alesh. Yes, thanks for dialing in, everyone. We have an hour, but as Alesh says, let's try to make this as interactive as possible. I've been coaxed to stop at the end of every slide, so please feel free to butt in and raise questions as we go. As Alesh says, I think we're taking a relatively short agenda, but hopefully with sufficient content to be able to start a bit of a discussion. I think this session tries to look at the energy transition from a political economy lens, and specifically tries to pose a viewpoint of analysis from a public policy point of view. So initially, we'll try to define what do we mean when we talk about the big public policy question, which is climate change, this notion of the collective action problem, and the credibility and durability challenges that we now face when we're talking about the political commitments around climate change. We're then going to look at three geographies, the UK, the US and China. We'll try to eke out, as Alesh says, the ambitions of those geographies, and those ambitions are different, the progress that those geographies have achieved to date, and really importantly, linking back to the first point, what are those public policy challenges? What are those challenges to the credibility and durability of those commitments in that national context? So hopefully that is enough for us to chew over the next hour. And as I say, let's make it as interactive as possible. So climate change then. I think, as Alesh says, pre-Paris climate change and the discussion about climate change took on a very technocratic frame of reference, if you like. It was a scientific, in many respects, question about, was climate change a challenge, and do we need something to do? Do we need to do something about it? I think something clearly fundamentally changed at Paris. It was the first time that there was uniformity, not on what should we do about the challenge, which is climate change, but certainly an acknowledgement, at least, that climate change is a real issue and that countries unanimously need to do something about it. Now, as we move away from that initial question to a bigger question in some respects, which is, well, what do we do about it? And how do we allocate the burdens that climate change will naturally create equitably, or in order to meet those net zero targets? And I think that really brings up the question of the credibility and durability challenge. And what do we mean by that? Well, we can see on the left-hand side then, our sort of friends from Climate Action Tracker has provided a view of what the existing pledges and targets mean to date, if we just take a live snapshot. But clearly there's a confidence interval around these pledges and targets, right? And that confidence is around the credibility and durability of those targets, because innately there is a conflict here. The political cycle is very short, spanning in most countries 5 years, 10 years maybe. But the challenge of climate change spans decades and requires sustained political effort in order to meet those climate goals. And the factors contributing to that credibility and durability risk are pretty obvious, right? The first is obviously the non-binding nature of political actors. Nothing a political or economic actor does cannot be undone by a future actor. And we'll touch on the US shortly, but clearly in some respects, Trump and Trump's America and Trump's approach to climate change from a US perspective really encapsulates that risk, that democratic risk, that economies continue to face and will face over the next decades. The second point is clearly varying salience. We know that climate change, and we'll talk about this in a UK context shortly, does have a high degree of salience at the moment. But we also know that history shows that the issues that dominate, capture the zeitgeist of a moment do change, and they change in accordance with political and economic conditions. And I do think it's worth pausing on the fact that we are and remain within the middle of a global pandemic, that the outcome of that pandemic is uncertain. And whilst we've had a period of economic stimulus, at some point that stimulus will need to be paid for, and the fiscal challenges that many countries face will become real over the next few years. We'll talk, of course, about Biden's infrastructure bill and Biden's stimulus in that respect as well. I think the third point here is the diffusion of power. We're very used to, and I'm sitting in London talking about political actors as powerful actors, the Westminster model having the executive and the legislative effectively in the same chamber. The Prime Minister should be able to implement what the Prime Minister says. But of course, we shouldn't be so Anglo-centric in that respect. We know that Biden and his administration, because of the split branches in Congress, faces huge political risk passing legislation in Congress. And we know also that the Chinese political structures are fundamentally different. The challenges between the center and the regions create political risks. And Xi Jinping will need to navigate those as well in the Chinese context. So it's not always the case that when political actors say something, they necessarily have the ability to implement it. And I think that we need to pause and reflect on that to a certain extent. And of course, lastly, and potentially the most evidently, there are competing priorities here. both economic and political goals don't often align with climate commitments. Climate commitments are long-term in the national collective interest, but especially in democratic societies, politics tends to be short-termist. And whether, as we move towards real questions about, for example, in the UK context, who pays for the retrofitting of heating, the removal and replacement of the gas network in the UK, those questions and trade-offs to voters' energy bills will become only more pertinent. So that's the initial framing that we're going to try to use for today's session, looking at this climate change question from a slightly different angle, hopefully an interesting one. And as I say, we're going to go through those three geographies shortly. On the bottom of this slide, you can just see a rough rag of, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about these geographies? The Paris commitment, broadly, you could say that actually, I mean, Paris at the moment for China is not very restrictive, and the UK is doing very well in terms of its Paris commitments. The US, of course, hasn't fully updated its new national commitments. But you can see there that the durability and credibility risks for each geography are quite different, and they relate to the specific domestic constraints, the domestic economic and political constraints of those geographies. And that's what we're going to go and talk through shortly. I'll pause briefly if there are any immediate thoughts on this slide or the approach of today's session. I take silence as, ecstatic support. So firstly, then we're going to talk about the United Kingdom. And I think, firstly, it's fair to say that the United Kingdom, obviously, where Baringa is based, has made some very significant and meaningful progress on climate change. And those commitments are palpable. One of the only countries to meet not only its Kyoto, but also Copenhagen commitment, and to be on course to meet its initial Paris goals of 40% reduction on 1990 levels by 2030. Of course, Carbon Budget 6 isn't fully disclosed at the moment, but we do know that that commitment to drive net zero by 2050 is an advancement on Carbon Budget 5's commitment of an 80% reduction by 2050. So real power, both in terms of the political commitment and the political leadership, obviously hosting in Glasgow, and, to a certain extent, a hallmark of British foreign policy. I don't think it's unreasonable to say at the moment, in terms of a post-Brexit era, about Brand Britain really pledging itself to the mantle of meaningful action on climate change, and certainly a core part of the transatlantic alliance with Biden now as well. You can see on the right-hand side, though, and I think Lord Dean, the head of the Climate Change Committee, said this yesterday, that in many respects, the risks for the UK relate to the fact that the UK has made some very significant progress, but that low-hanging fruit is busted. He described it as the next decade or the next stage of decarbonisation being much more intimate than the previous decades. The idea that much of the decarbonisation success that the UK has achieved to date has in many respects been within the plumbing from a voter and even a consumer point of view. Fundamentally, when we flick the switch on, it hasn't infected necessarily the consumer hugely in an intimate respect. That coal has been stripped out of the energy mix. So I think it is fair to say that when we think about the risks, and you can see on the right-hand side, maybe from the Carbon 5 budget projections, that in industrial, in energy generation, there's been serious and meaningful progress. But in transport and in residential, where the impact on individuals, voters and consumers could be much more meaningful, the introduction and removal of the internal combustion engine, the rollout of EVs, the costs associated with that, we still don't have price parity, anywhere near price parity on those vehicles. And also the costs related to residential costs. I mean, 86% of UK housing stock remains heated by gas. We know that the cost of retrofitting, because of the age of the UK housing stock, is set to be ginormous, £20,000 roughly per house. That's about 600 billion in total. And there are real public policy questions, right, about how is that going to be paid for? And it will have a much more pertinent and potentially more salient issue for many voters and consumers than potentially the phase out of coal, which has driven so much of the progress from a UK perspective to date. So that does raise potential issues and risks about the durability and credibility of these targets and the political commitment to these, because I'd suggest that actually this is the first time potentially that more controversial elements of the decarbonisation agenda are going to become very, very palpable and salient for many people. Pause there again. So on that vein, then, when we're looking about when we're thinking about the United Kingdom, we do have to think about potential economic and political risks. And I think the two challenges for the UK from a credibility and durability point of view are clearly the fiscal and the long-dated nature of the political commitment. We know that political bipartisan commitment in the UK has been very strong up until now. Really since the 1980s, actually, there's been bipartisan support for climate action. That's very different from the United States, of course, which we'll touch on later. But the question there is, how sustainable is that in the long term? And I think that's particularly pertinent when we look on the left-hand side there and look at the fiscal pressures that the UK is now in. Obviously, the recent budget statement by Sunak, tax burden expected to be the highest since the 1960s, the deficit projected to be 9% of GDP, both public, private and corporate debt breaking all historical levels. At the same time, as we know that there's real pain in the labour market and consumers are feeling pain at the moment, right? Stagnant UK wages there on the right-hand side. Wages in real terms remain below pre-2007 peak. And I think put together, this does paint a challenging picture in the short term. We know the demographic outlook is relatively adverse for the United Kingdom as well. On the bottom there in graph 3, you can see that under quite a moderate interest rate spike projection, the cost of servicing UK debt would rise to about the same size as the education and defence budget combined, so about 3.5% of GDP. So the medium-term outlook, of course, does need to be taken into consideration when we're talking about the scale and size of the investment and infrastructure required to meet those next wave, the next decade of decarbonisation commitments. And I think that does speak on to the right-hand side, which is around the political breadth and depth of support for the climate transition, the energy transition in the UK. We know in graph 4 that actually at the moment, UK salience on climate change is really high, and there is broad support. But there's always questions in the UK, at least, about the depth of that support. We know that the prioritisation of climate action is heavily correlated and volatile to economic and political conditions. We know it's taken nosedives, most notably during 2008. I think it's fair to say it hasn't yet, but there are questions about to what extent the sustainability of that popular mobilisation is in light of these rising fiscal pressures, when of course political calculations and political costs about how budgets can be funded and remain sustainable in the long term can be put on a stable footing. And I think then the last point on this slide is graph 5, that what we've seen from the development of the Conservative Party over the last 4 decades, the last 5 elections, is a movement towards blue-collar conservatism that we haven't seen for several decades. In dark blue there, you can see from in the light blue chart, 1997 support, all the way to dark blue in 2019. And if you look at that social grade spectrum, A, B, C1, C2, and DE, you see Conservative support has risen dramatically amongst C2 and DE voters, that kind of progress in the so-called red wall seats being very palpable in terms of the income demographic of Conservative support. This has fundamentally changed the nature, I suggest, of the Conservative Party in many ways. But one of the ways that it has, and we think back to Cameron's vote blue, go green policy, is that the Conservative coalition is much less pro-environmental protection now than it once was. To the extent that that is significant, of course, remains unknown. We don't know the extent, but you can see in that pink line there that we know that C2 and DE voters, for obvious reasons, are potentially more sceptical about some of the climate policies that may lead to higher costs, lower standards of living, etc., etc. So the question for the Conservative Party is, in the face of an agenda on levelling up, in the face of huge commitments to former red wall seats in terms of infrastructure spending, to what extent do those two ambitions reconcile? Or do they, over the years ahead, as those fiscal pressures continue to bite, start to conflict? I think it's a tail risk, but again, Lord Dean did make the point that the ever-present threat of rollback, of pushback on climate change commitments is something that's really serious, and it goes to the very heart, of course, about what we mean when we talk about the durability and credibility of commitments. I will stop there before we go on to the US, if there are any thoughts immediately on the UK context.
That's right. I had an immediate question, which was, when do you think the this all bites in terms of the conflict that you've described between post-COVID measures to be taken by government and the cost of those and climate commitments? You know, is that going to hit this year? Is it going to be in 3 years' time? What's your sense of where these things start to come to a head?
I definitely think it's long dated, right? I think it's a 5-year post mark. I think we've got to see what happens ultimately with UK debt sustainability and really what happens with long-term interest rates. So, I mean, we've been enjoying an ultra loose monetary policy environment where interest rates on long-term government debt are negligible. If that story starts to change, then these risks, I suggest, become really potent. Now, there are lots of reasons that people would say, well, Caspian, I don't think they will change. You know, we've been talking about higher rates environment for a decade now, and it hasn't happened. Really, since 2008, we've been talking about the threat of higher interest rates. It hasn't materialized. There is a school of thought that says maybe this is a permanently low rate environment. The central banks can always buy government debt and keep those yields low. I think certainly the view of Sunak and the traditional heart of the, you may call it market orientated wing of the Conservative Party, is that that's a huge risk and a gamble to take. And they'll be wanting to balance and achieve debt sustainability well before any risks of a higher interest rate environment manifest themselves. But I think that's the real risk, and I think it's the 3 to 5 to 10 year mark where you start to take a proper gauge on, have we got a debt problem in the UK, and what does that mean in terms of many of these infrastructure commitments?
And slightly more cheekily, how much of the current focus and rhetoric do you think is really driven by two events, COP26 and G7 this year? You know, how much of that is a bit of grandstanding and a bit of re-establishing some political weight in the global stage for the current government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think clearly the UK and Number 10 found itself isolated in Washington, and my understanding was they were surprised to the extent that it did. They were surprised about the level of private and public coldness from the incoming Biden administration. That's thawed quite dramatically since then, but certainly before the inauguration, my understanding from some people in the Foreign Office was, I think the UK was slightly shocked, and it did seem personal, that Boris's reputation in Washington amongst these Democrat circles was pretty low. So I do think you've got to put that into this view about UK foreign policy, and with the UK Defence Review, very similar, right? Was that UK Defence Review written in Washington? You know, we're told not, but clearly Washington's influence and the desire for London to be amenable on many of these issues, whether it be defence in the Asia Pacific or climate change, which so happen to be Biden's foreign policy goals, I think is self-evident, right? That, yes, there's a desire to be totally aligned on those issues. Okay. I don't think it's so cynical as to we don't consider them completely, but yeah, it helps, right?
It does. And certainly, I mean, the work we're doing for government right now on net zero, which is very significant, for a very important series of projects that we're undertaking for government in this area, I think is certainly indicating a level of attention and detail focus, which we certainly haven't seen over the last 4 or 5 years as government's been distracted on other issues, no less Brexit over that period, and that refocus now resources into these material issues are really important. Great. Let's keep going, I think.
So, guys, just briefly on the US then, from Trump to Biden, how do we conceptualize this transition? Obviously, hugely fundamental. Probably first, we just need to kind of review. Maybe it feels like a long time ago already, but obviously Trump was president of the United States for 4 years, and he did have an energy agenda. And I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of thinking Trump didn't have an energy agenda because that energy agenda wasn't aligned on many of the consensus points on climate change. But it was an agenda, and we can encapsulate it as energy dominance, a fundamental belief in energy self-sufficiency from the United States, effectively driven by the shale gas revolution. And you can see on the left-hand side there that US shale gas break-even cost plummeting really in the last 5-10 years, being price competitive with Middle East gas, LNG and oil, and effectively aligning to Trump's strategy, right, to bring blue-collar industrial jobs back to America. Very, very potent electoral messages against Obama and his war on coal, or war on blue-collar workers, as he says. And in that second graph, you can see oil and gas and coal extraction payroll under Obama and Trump. Sharp reductions under Obama provided a large stick, of course, for the Trump campaign in 2016. The Trump promises weren't fulfilled. As you can see, there wasn't a dramatic increase in traditional energy employment payroll, but it did stabilize. As we know, that wasn't sufficient to maintain Republican support in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, et cetera, those crucial Rust Belt seats. But it was part of a strategy, an energy strategy, and it was around bringing self-sufficiency and jobs back to many of these states, these oil and gas states. It also had a foreign policy dimension, which I think we also under-discuss. You know, for the first time in several decades, there is no US formal permanent presence in the Middle East, which, depending on how old you are on the call, it could be pretty shocking that is the case. And that was clearly a core part of Trump's foreign policy agenda as well. So shale gas revolution, bringing jobs back to crucial swing states and providing energy security through energy sufficiency, encapsulates Trump's agenda. Now, the cost of that, and we're more likely to know the cost of that, is international inaction on climate change, pulling out famously of the Paris Climate Accord, but also those regulatory rollbacks of those environmental standards, which sought effectively to support shale gas extraction and get shale gas to be as competitive, or any drilling, to be honest, oil as well, as competitive as possible in international markets. We know, for example, rollbacks on methane leak monitoring, power plant expansion, coal quality emission reviews were scrapped, or at least watered down. But in many respects, I suggest quite a lot of commentators say the real cost of the Trump administration on climate change was the cost of inaction. Lots of things can be redone, but of course we are against a ticking clock when it comes to climate change. And in many respects, in terms of climate change, Trump was 4 years of inaction and a serious step back for the climate agenda. I'll pause briefly on Trump. I don't think there's anything hopefully controversial on that slide. Fine. So Biden then, this is the interesting stuff. Where are we at? Well, Biden sees, I think, an opportunity here. He has two goals, economic and climate, and in many respects, there's an alignment between these goals. On the left-hand side, you can see average hourly compensation in the United States from 1948 to 2010. That golden age of American capitalism, the golden age of American growth in pink, rising average hourly compensation rates, and then really since the 1980s, stagnation in the labor market. And those are real terms, compensation. So no real increase palpably in American incomes over the last 50 years. And that speaks to what we know about populist politics, the backlash against the perceived free market economic liberalism of the last 30 years of the Reagan-Thatcher settlement. And so with a younger, more diverse Democrat caucus, with an activist, mobilized base, Biden's under huge pressure to deliver not just a climate revolution, but an economic revolution. Not just because he thinks that's the right thing to do, but because, frankly, it makes the Trump experiment makes real the risks of disenfranchised voters to the political system for the Democrats. I think it can't be overstated quite how shocking the thoughts of Wisconsin, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania going Republican in that way was in 2016. So there's an economic challenge which Biden is set to address, and there is a climate challenge. And clearly, the US at the moment is well off from achieving its Paris goals. It does have verbally from Biden a net zero commitment by 2050. Biden's also indicated carbon neutrality in the electrical generation system by 2035. And there is an expectation from the climate conference that actually his goals could be upgraded even to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, which would be a huge, huge upgrade in political commitment. So not to eat the point out, but there's clearly huge synergies here between Biden's goals, right? Both require huge amounts of infrastructure investment. Both can align to high productive jobs, especially in renewable industries. And both seek to restore America as a leader on the world stage and to give America confidence at home. And so at the moment, at least, we can see in Biden's agenda actually some alignment between the economic ambitions of the administration and the climate ambitions of the administration. So what are the mechanisms of which change is likely to be enacted? Well, we can kind of break this down, and of course we have to, in the split branches system between regulatory, executive order and legislative. Regulatory and executive order, I think, are the simple things, the low-hanging fruits, and much of this is the rollback of Trump-era regulations. So we know, for example, the monitoring of methane, the regulation of shale gas flaring, et cetera, is likely to be reimposed. And certainly on the executive order front, we've already seen commitments to increase vehicle emissions and fuel efficiency standards in automotive vehicles. We also know there was that memorandum on shale fracking on public land, on federal land, and a commitment to introduce more robust assessments for coal plant emissions and gas and power plant emissions as well. But in many respects, the big change has to come from legislation, and we haven't seen meaningful energy legislation pass in the US for over 30 years. I do think it's worth saying that, right? The nature of the partisan frictions within Congress mean that no substantial energy policy has been passed through Congress for over 30 years. So, you know, high hopes for the Biden administration, of course, but huge political risks, right? Huge political risks. Are fracking bans likely? I think unlikely. We know that there are many Democrat senators who frankly won't support that in the Congress. And with a majority of just one, the VP tiebreak, the arithmetic in the Senate specifically is really, really tight. Having said that, we do know that bills can be passed. That 1.9 trillion stimulus package was passed, and there are high hopes for this infrastructure bill that's coming down the track, $2 trillion infrastructure bill to pass. Now, if that did pass, many of those renewable energy subsidies, including the tax credit and the production tax credit, would be reintroduced and extended. That would be really important for renewable energy investors, specifically in southern states, maybe where actually state level support is relatively thin. But there are big challenges to that. We know the Republicans want a really shallow deal. They want a deal that focuses more explicitly on road and rail, sort of hard infrastructure. And they're very dubious about including items in the bill which they see as political. So, for example, commitments on EV charging infrastructure, or the removal of carbon fossil subsidies, for example. So huge challenges in terms of the legislative agenda. And I guess very briefly, we can kind of understand that in the US context by really appreciating the partisan nature of the climate and energy debate in the US. On the left-hand side, then you can see the party difference between support or concern as a major threat on climate change. There's almost no other country in the world which has that level of partisan divide on the climate issue. And that leads to deadlock in Congress. And you can see in that second graph here, states by energy employment by Republican and Democrat. Candidly, those states with higher levels of energy employment, traditional energy employment, tend to vote Republican, and needless to say, are robust in the defense of fossil fuel jobs, extraction, mining. And look, if you can even see in that graph, some of those blue flicks of Democrat support, like Joe Manchin in West Virginia or Bob Cassidy in Pennsylvania, are crucial for Biden to get things done. So Joe Manchin in West Virginia needs to go and tell coal workers why he is supporting a clean energy standard that would remove coal from the energy mix. Now, he's clear he won't do that. And he's the 50th Democrat senator in the Senate. So huge challenges for Biden on the arithmetic to get much of this legislation through. And I think, especially from a European audience, that's often underappreciated, I think it's fair to say, quite how challenging the political environment is in the US to get these kind of controversial bills past Congress. I'll pause here maybe for any thoughts on the US picture. Okay, so I think in summary then, from a US angle, we expect from Biden, yes, there will be the introduction or extension of tax credits and subsidies for renewables. But I think that we have to be a little bit more pessimistic potentially on the big legislation that would, for example, ban shale gas extraction or mandate through a clean energy standard 100% zero carbon or zero fossil fuel electricity generation by 2035. Those pieces of legislation are going to come under sustained attack from both Republicans, but also coal and gas state Democrat senators in the months ahead. And it will be really fascinating to see what can get done. Biden, of course, traditionally is held up as a political insider. He knows these guys. He's been talking to these guys for literally decades. So the argument is in Washington, if anyone can get a deal, it's Joe. I think we really need to wait and see whether that's true. Clearly, there are routes for compromise, specifically on the clean energy standard, which would mandate renewable generation by 2035, 100% carbon free. The use or introduction of carbon capture options could try to bring people like Joe Manchin on side in West Virginia, a famous coal state. But clearly, there are some challenges there, and this costs a lot of money. And the opportunity for bipartisan cooperation looks very, very weak. So that's the kind of US outlook. Any other thoughts before we go on to China?
Yeah, that's great. I think just a time check, Caspian, about 15 minutes or so left. Yeah. So yeah, good to just get into China, and then we'll see whether there's any questions.
Cool. So very briefly then on this slide, how do we start to think about the Chinese energy transition? Clearly, China's goals from Xi Jinping are palpable. We've got the carbon neutral commitment by 2060 and reductions on carbon intensity as 65% by 2030. Breaking missing the Copenhagen target, but on course at the moment, post-COVID especially, to meet that Paris goal of 33% peak on emissions by 2030. But I think there are some risks to the US climate transition as well. And those really relate to the fact that much of the climate commitments from the Central Party are really driven by other issues that are tangentially related. So primarily things like energy security, the desire to get off oil imports and LNG imports, the desire to provide better air quality, especially for the urban middle class, to reincorporate Chinese image, to demonstrate Chinese leadership on the world stage, but also to wean China off a relatively poor capital allocation economic model to a higher technological leadership model of the economy. And so we've got to see those goals for what they are And that helps us understand why some of the Chinese energy transition may look quite bizarre from an outsider's perspective. How do we understand Chinese commitments or the Chinese energy transition thus far? Well, the Chinese energy model, the Chinese energy innovation system, as they call it, really has 4 constituent parts. The first is high levels of investment. We know that the Chinese economic model is an investment-led model. Investment represents about 40% of GDP in China, and sustained levels of renewable investment for several decades. Really the first mass mover of deployment of investment in renewables has been astonishing in China, and that continues to this day. The second step of their model is vertical integration within the supply chains. We know that strategically state-owned enterprises seek to vertically integrate, to dominate the supply and manufacture of solar cells in this example, but also other technologies. And we know that by extension that allows them to deploy at scale and achieve a cost advantage. That same view of solar cell costs from 2009 to 2019. Finally, then, leveraging a large domestic market and increasingly wealthy middle class in China to effectively leverage and gain those economies of scale and then dominate export markets as well. So that model of energy technology is both economical, political, and climate related. And really, when we start to understand the Chinese energy transition, we have to see all of these competing aims holistically, because in many respects, the Central Communist Party sees these priorities of political stability as deeply entrenched and intertwined with economic growth. And by extension, economic growth is reliant on access of new technologies that are going to power the future tomorrow. And so renewable energy investment clearly ticks a number of those boxes. There are challenges for China, though, and we'll probably leave it on this slide. We call it the Chinese decarbonization trilemma. Fundamentally, China has 3 competing goals that conflict when it's thinking about the energy transition. The first is energy security. We know that energy security within China is a real issue. About 80% of energy imports pass through the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea, and I'm sure everyone on this call knows that the South China Sea is increasingly an area of geopolitical friction. And party officials in China are acutely aware that this places China at a strategic disadvantage. At the same time as the US has become energy sufficient, China remains deeply dependent on the imports of natural gas and oil. It doesn't have domestic supplies. It does have an abundance of coal, which leads to the second competing goal, which is a coal phase out necessarily depends either on compromising on energy security by importing and replacing gas, and certainly that would achieve a relatively rapid decarbonisation. We saw that in Western markets. The swapping of coal to gas helps rapidly decarbonise the grid. But the coal phase out would thereby depend on the intermittency of renewables. And we know that blackouts in Beijing, for example, are relatively common. We know that the coal-fired backup stations in Beijing, which haven't been operational for 4 or 5 years, are repeatedly now brought online in order to cope and manage the intermittency of renewables. And we also know that those blackouts have changed the political weather amongst some party supporters. It's not an unusual turn of phrase in China to call or relate renewable energy to garbage energy because of the challenges of intermittency. And when we're talking about the transmission of renewable energy across China, the geographical distances we're talking about are huge. The strategic engineering challenges of bringing that level of energy capacity from the rural regions where solar and wind power is placed to those urban centres is ginormous. So China has to choose. The initial constraints of energy storage and intermittency really creates this trilemma. Which priority is China willing to sacrifice? Is it going to pursue slow but stable decarbonisation by prioritising energy security and maintaining its production of coal? Is it going to prioritise fast but unstable decarbonisation by exposing itself to the intermittency of renewables? Or is it going to pursue fast but risky decarbonisation, effectively undermining energy security by increasingly becoming more dependent on imports of natural gas and oil? I think, given the time, maybe we pause for questions, and then if we do want to have the kind of conversation on this last slide, we can do, but probably pause here for a second, Alesh.
Yeah, I think that's great. Just pause here and take any comments from attendees, take any questions here to get us started whilst maybe attendees are thinking. Please feel free to raise your hand virtually or just post a question or come off for you. But I'm just going to look forward to the summer and G7, Caspian, and in the context of what you'd said and your optimism or lack of about the G7 reaching any more material and meaningful concords at the summit, and what might happen and not happen at that summit. Get any short thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was interesting is actually there had been hopes that China would bring forward their peak emissions commitment to 2025, and we haven't seen that from the 14th five-year plan. Actually, we saw much of the same. The if you like, marginal improvement was effectively replicated, a carbon copy, if you pardon the pun, of the last five-year plan. Relatively good reductions in carbon, commitments to peak emissions, yes, commitments to increase renewable energy generation. But actually what we wanted to see, and what I think many foreign observers were hoping to see, was meaningful change in peak emissions by bringing forward many of those commitments. Because a lot of Chinese commitments at the moment are long dated and they're verbal. And there is a challenge at the moment of how do we start to see meaningful progress. And I think that's in terms of the wider geopolitical and ahead of the COP. G7 specifically, Biden is expected to update his commitments in a really meaningful way. I think we mentioned, that there has been talk, and this is maybe where expectation management could undermine Biden a little bit, but of upgrading those commitments to a 50% reduction of 1990 levels by 2030. That would be ginormous. The UK obviously already disclosing its national commitments as well. So I think positive on the G7 lens, but of course, as we know, the G7 as a forum is an increasingly small proportion, not just of political and economic weight in the world, but also carbon emissions. So yes, there's still a role for the G7 in terms of global leadership, but we also need to see meaningful action at home in the US, but also abroad in India and in China as well.
Great, really helpful. Questions from attendees? Please just feel free to take us off mute and ask a question or a comment. Hi, Matthew. Yeah, go ahead, Matthew.
Hi, Alesh and Caspian. Thank you very much indeed. I was wondering if I might be so bold as to ask about the EU, which is obviously the kind of other major market with regulatory power and clearly very ambitious targets. Maybe a few words on where the EU is and how then, in the context of G7 and G20 and COP, the key markets plus the UK holding the presidency might actually start to tie some of these strands together. Thanks.
Yeah, I was hoping someone would note the key emission of the 4 major emitting regions, Matthew, so I'm glad you asked that question. So I'll let Caspian seamlessly note a couple of comments. And it's not a deliberate emission, so I think it's a time emission rather than a deliberate emission. Caspian, over to you.
Potentially an emission because my answer may be quite boring or uninteresting, which is clearly the EU is in many respects the leader in this. It's a technocratic rules-based structure. Credibility and durability issues are less of a challenge when we think about the EU as a construct. It is in many respects a legal construct which is bound by its own mechanisms of compliance and accountability. in terms of the political weather, I think things look positive for the EU, and I think its commitments to this are relatively, not relatively solid, are very solid. I think there are always tail risks, and clearly, in terms of the divergence between North and South economically and all of the risks around fiscal integration that the EU faces coming out of COVID, there are, of course, the ever-present risks in the Eurozone, which the Eurozone represents an unfinished project and can cause significant distractions from maybe other goals, such as climate. We've seen Italian and Spanish bond yields tipping up recently in light of COVID-19, and I think those are the real tail risks. But broadly, the emission is because the EU represents a really solid actor on this in terms of world commitments on the world stage, and I think acts as a very credible actor in that respect. And certainly the story so far has focused on these other regions where these political risk elements are more palpable, if you like. Alesh, maybe.
I think I'm spot on, Caspian. I look at your summary. I think you summarised it really well there with respect to the EU. I look at it as the UK has an ambitious agenda, but in the reality of the global footprint of the impact that the UK can have, it's relatively limited. The US can have a major impact, but it's slightly hamstrung by the political system you described and the compact you described. China can clearly have a huge impact, but it's also hamstrung, but for different reasons, not necessarily the political system, but it's hamstrung by a desire to support both its coal and domestic energy industry and energy security, and that's almost an offsetting factor, the US political constraint. So I look at these constraints, and they're just different types of constraint across meeting net zero targets, and therefore my conclusion out of all of that is it is going to be very difficult to define a pathway for each of these nation states that has common elements to it. There will be unique pathways, and there will be, as we've described in other webinars, a bumpy journey to net zero. There's not going to be some smooth linear decline towards net zero. It's going to be a bumpy journey, and a lot of the choices ahead are about which of those bumps are navigable and which aren't navigable over the next 10 years in particular, which is that kind of critical period when some of the key technology, business and policy decisions need to be made.
I do. This is an ever-present issue. Once we've gotten away from the agreement that this is an issue and something needs to be done, this question of slippage, this question of continual commitment is one that will remain, I suspect, extremely salient over the next few years and decades.
More questions? Please feel free to take yourself off mute and either ask a question or make a comment. John, I think John is.
Yeah. Hi there. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Morning. Thanks so much for that. Great amount of information there to take in. Ilesh, you just mentioned indeed that the UK is rather a pinprick in terms of its emissions, and the temptation might be to argue what's the point in some respects, but we're involved in electrical power distribution networks, and I personally feel like we've got a massive opportunity to show a leadership role, to take a leadership role in the technology that could help reach our targets. So I just wondered what Caspian, Ilesh, what you feel the UK's role in leading the way, and indeed what the opportunity might be as we come out of the pandemic and life outside of the EU.
I think that's a great point. I think that's a really good point around the EU. I also see Australia as another example of a market where we're testing a lot of the policies, technologies, business models, adoptions that will enable decarbonisation pathways, and other countries can learn from that. So I think the UK is a great example that Europe has been, of course, right the way through the late 1990s, early 2000s. There has been a great testing ground for the three pillars of policy, technology, and business model. How do I earn money out of a low carbon transition, which is really important for commercial enterprise. And I think we can play an important role in that and export that learning and understanding. How we monetize that, I think, is a good question. So that would be my tuppence worth on the role we can play, but it's not going to be in terms of emissions impacts and tons of carbon offset. It's not going to be. That's not. Caspian, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that.
I obviously agree. We're less than 1%. can we can we add our voice to a moral coalition of like-minded countries that are prepared to act fast and aggressively and take on our share of the burden? Yes, absolutely. And the UK is a really important part of that coalition. And I think maybe even the central part from a middling country point of view. So yeah, I think there's lots of things to be positive about.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Well, look, I think just in closing, I won't do any more summary than Caspian's done. Thank you, Caspian, and thank you for all the questions as well. They're fantastic to see so many industry colleagues and clients on this webinar today. Please do get in touch with any of the Baringa team speaking here today if you've got further questions or want to follow up on areas of interest, or indeed would like to talk to us about net zero and the transition to a low carbon economy. We'd be delighted to have one of you speak with us at another webinar to come. So if you're interested in that, please drop me a line, and I'll be happy to have a look at what's in our schedule and see whether there's anything helpful that we can slot one of you into. Next webinar is on the 26th of April, I believe, and will include look at the Nordics. Nordics is such an important region within Europe, both in terms of electrification and renewables, and we'll be looking at what the future holds for renewables in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. So delighted if you can join us then.